name is Evan Seth, and I'm currently a high school junior looking to go to college for an Aerospace/Astrophysics degree. I started this channel because I wanted to give fellow high schoolers an introduction to what I think is the greatest field of science, which is space science. So under that umbrella, it includes astrophysics, aerospace engineering, everything that has to do with, going up to space, keeping things in space, studying the things around us in space. Yeah, everything having to do with going up there and staying there. So, without further ado, let's just get started with the video. All right. So, many of you who have been watching the news recently may have heard about the Artemis 1 program and the Orion capsule making its way home, finally landing after going around in orbit in the moon. And a lot of you probably wondered, well, how did it get there, right? I mean, we haven't been there in 50 years, right? How did we get it there this time? And the answer is we used the SLS, NASA's new heavy lifter rocket. And some of you who may have looked at the specs and the statistics of the SLS may have realized something. This is no small rocket. I mean, this is 29 stories tall, almost as tall as a Saturn V. And some of you may have wondered, well, it's probably very heavy, right? So how did they get it to go so fast? And that's what today's video is on. I mean, let's think about it, right? The moon is almost 400,000 kilometers away, right? How is it that we got this rocket that's the size of a normal building, maybe even taller than a normal building, all the way there? Well, the answer is the full rocket didn't go there. That's a simple answer. And the more complicated answer is what this video is on about. So, yeah. All right. So this video is going to be on rocket engines, how a rocket moves, propulsion systems, all that type of stuff. So let's get started. Before we talk about how a rocket moves, we're going to talk about how a car moves, because that's something that a lot of us have experience with. So it's probably easier to start on that than it is to start talking about a rocket, which, statistically, no one really has experience on. So the way a car moves, right, is the engine rotates an axle, which rotates the wheels, and the wheels rotate against the ground, and it pushes you forward, right? So let's try and figure out which single component makes the car move, right? Well, let's think about it. The engine, right? That's what a lot of people's first thoughts go when you hear what makes the car move. People go, oh, the engine makes the car move, right? Well, let's think about it. The engine makes the axle spin, but if you put the engine without wheels, the engine's not going anywhere, right? I mean, it's just gonna sit there, running as normal. Okay, so then people will go, okay, the wheels make the car go, right? And we know that intuitively it makes sense, but we also can easily pull up examples for why that's not true, right? Think about an extremely icy road. You can spin your wheels all you want, the car's not gonna go anywhere, right? That's why a lot of slip and slides happen, right? Because the wheels require friction to be able to move. So what makes the car go? The ground, right? The friction with the ground is what's causing the car to move, and this is because of Newton's third law. The car pushes against the ground when the wheels turn, and thus the ground must push against the car, which is why the car goes forward, right? I can demonstrate this property right now by just jumping, right? My legs push against the ground, and the ground has to push back, so I go up, right? It's the same process with the car. So now let's try and apply this to the rocket. So the rocket, in essence, the engine is just pushing an extremely hot stream of gases out, right? It's exploding inside of it, and then it's pushing all the gases out. So by Newton's third law, that pushing of the gases must result in the same force being applied to the rocket, and thus the rocket moves upwards. All right, so let's talk about some of we're gonna start with the simpler types of rocket engines, then we're gonna work our way up to the more complex liquid rocket engine. So the first thing we're gonna start with is a solid rocket engine. All right, so in a solid rocket engine, you have an engine, I was gonna draw an entire rocket, and then I realized I'd have to do that for all of them. All right. In the solid rocket engine, at its most basic, So this is a solid rocket engine, also commonly abbreviated as an SRB, or a solid rocket booster, in its full state. And the way a solid rocket engine works is that you'll have a cylinder full of fuel, but you'll have a hole that's drilled all the way through it. And this hole can be a variety of sizes and shapes depending on the amount of thrust you want. Because we've tested this, and if you have like a star shape through the middle, you get a more consistent amount of thrust. Whereas if you put different types of shapes, you can get thrust curves that look like that, right? Where you have an extremely high burst of thrust at the start. And this is nice for us because we can kind of preemptively decide how much thrust we want where. And so going away from the hole now, let's talk about what this stuff around the hole is made up of, right? So what's around the hole is what's called a solid rocket propellant. Right? And the purpose of a solid rocket propellant is that when it's burned, it'll release hot gases that, will push the rocket up. So what makes a solid rocket propellant? Well, how do we make a fire, right? Because that's essentially what the exhaust is, right? A fire is made with fuel, right? So a lot of cases like wood, right? If you think about your fireplace, wood. And what else do you need for a fire? Well, you need oxygen, right? Because how do you put out a candle? You cover it up, right? You put the cap on it, and that's because you're blocking the flow of oxygen. And thus, we know that the fire needs oxygen, right? So, how do we get fuel and oxygen in here? Well, a lot of solid rocket boosters are made of a mixture of fuel and oxidizer. Now, what is an oxidizer? An oxidizer is just a chemical that, when it gets heated up or has a chemical reaction, releases a lot of oxygen. So, when this thing is ignited, it'll burn the fuel, using atmospheric air, and then that heat will release the oxygen trapped inside of an oxidizer, thus giving more oxygen to the fire, and this more energetic fire, right? Because the more oxygen you put into a fire, the more energetic, the more hot it is. The higher temperatures it can reach, the faster it burns, that type of stuff. Because you're just accelerating the reaction. So this will start slow, and then all of a sudden it'll completely fill up the chamber and just burn the entire tube down. And this is exactly what we want, right? Because this will be a solid, nice, consistent thrust. And by doing this, we can achieve ignition and we can achieve thrust. And but there are disadvantages to a solid rocket boosters, and there's advantages. So let's do a little pros and cons here. Pros, cons. Right? So what do we have for the pros? Well, they're very simple. There's no moving parts, so therefore they're very cheap. Well, in the grand scheme of things, when you're talking about rockets, your price point's in like the millions of billions. So relative to the other parts in the rocket, this is much cheaper. So we have cheap. Now let's talk about a con. So, going back to the candle situation, how did we put the candle out, right? We covered it. But you can't really do that here, right? Because it has the oxygen in the fuel rod. So how do you put it out? You can't, right? So they're non-throttleable. I don't know if that's a word actually, but you get what I'm saying. You can't throttle the amount of thrust that you're getting out of this, right? Because you can't block it up, or else you're going to cause a buildup of pressure, which will detonate, and that's what we like to call a rapid unplanned disassembly. And that's obviously not ideal. So the pros here is that it's very cheap, and the con is that it's not throttleable. But also pro, they're very powerful. If you've ever seen the SRB for the SOS, you can look up a video. I mean, it's very, very strong, right? Like, it's basically just an explosion that happens over a little bit of time. That's essentially what a solid rocket booster is. It's a controlled explosion. Yeah, that's basically it for solid rocket boosters. There's a lot of different types of fuels that you can use. If you guys want, I can make a video going over different types of fuels and oxidizers for this. You know, you can use sugar for a fuel. Obviously, you'll have to get an oxidizer, but you can literally use sugar for a fuel, and that's what's called a sugar rocket in model rocketry. And they are quite powerful, so I would not recommend you go playing around with them unless you know what you're doing. But yeah, that kind of wraps it up for solid rocket boosters. Let me just erase this, and I'll get started with the next type, which is a hybrid rocket booster. Alright, sorry about that. So yeah, we're going to talk about a hybrid rocket booster. And there's two types of hybrid rocket engines. They have the same structure in general, so I will just draw two copies of the exact same thing. Too close. Okay. And I'll just draw a little nozzle here. And I'll talk about a little bit why nozzles look like that in a little bit. So this is a hybrid rocket engine, right? It looks very similar if you get rid of this part here, right? This looks like a solid rocket booster, right? And again, this is a hollow tube through a cylinder, just like the before, right? The difference is that you only have one thing inside the tube. So let's say this one, we're gonna have fuel in the tube, and this tank here, this is gonna be oxidizer, right? And, sorry, let's get started with the other one. So if we have fuel down here and oxidizer here, obviously the only other combination is you switch it. So now we have fuel as a liquid and oxidizer as a solid. And thus here arises the major difference. In a hybrid rocket engine, one of your combustion components is in a liquid form rather than a solid form mixed along with the fuel or with the oxidizer, vice versa. And here's how this works. You'll have a liquid oxidizer in this one, right? I'm just gonna fill it in here. And you have a valve. These are both valves. And when the valve releases, the oxidizer actually flows down the tube. And you can ignite this now because if your fuel and your oxidizer are in close proximity, you can ignite this and you'll get thrust, right? You'll be releasing the combustion out through the nozzle and thus thrust because of Newton's third law as we discussed earlier. Same thing happens here. In this case, you have the oxidizer here, right? And when you have liquid fuel flowing down this tube, assuming that the tube is open, you now have a mixture of fuel and oxidizer in your combustion chamber. And again, when you ignite this, you'll get thrust, and you'll get because again, you're releasing the components of your combustion out through the nozzle. And we can talk about pros and cons of this as well. So pros. Now the pros are you can throttle it. The cons are, well, you have moving parts now. You have points of failure. As well as, because you're adding these tanks for oxidizer and fuel, they need to be cryogenic. So now you have to bring in cryogenic tanks. And here's why, right? You might be saying, oh, well, why don't we just use propane tanks, right? Like the ones that you use for your grill, they don't have to be cryogenic, right? The issue with that is the propane there is going to be stored as a gas, right? All right, well, okay. Like, they need to be stored as a liquid for a long time because, you know, these rockets sit on the pad for a while and they're going up through space. You know, you have to let the fluid sit as it is for a long time, and it needs to be a liquid, right? Because let's think about it. If we want to get the most bang for our buck, and that's really what we want to do when we're making rockets, is get the most thrust per dollar, right? How do we do that? Well, if you use a gas for either one of these, you're using a less dense version of the fluid, right? Because what is a gas? It's just an evaporated version of the fluid, right? And the issue with evaporated fluids is, you know, you have a lot less particles per, I don't know, like square meter than liquids do, right? They're a lot less denser, and this is kind of the opposite of what we want, right? We want to have as much fuel as here as possible. And the way to do that is, well, we'll want to use a liquid because it'll contain more volume, it'll contain more matter per volume than a gas will. And thus, we need high pressure cryogenic tanks. So, again, that brings up money, and tanks are heavy, right? That brings up mass as well. Because I have to worry about bringing this mass of the tanks, the pipes, the valves. You know, it gets very heavy very quickly. Although, this is throttleable though, and you can turn this one off, which is really good. So those are the pros and cons of a hybrid rocket engine. But let's talk about, what about in between these two, right? Which one of these is better? So, let's think about it. In one end, we have the fuel up top, and in one end, we have the oxidizer on top, right? And, you know, in one end, we have the fuel on the bottom, and the oxidizer on the bottom. So, let's think about, what is the best oxidizer, right? Well, we could list a long name of chemicals, but really what we want is just oxygen, right? So why don't we just put oxygen in there, right? And that's exactly why this one is better than this, because you can't have solid oxygen, really. Like, you can have it, but it's not going to stay there for very long. And also, it requires extremely low temperatures, and then you'd have to cryocool this whole tank, which is ridiculous. Up here, you need oxygen in a liquid, which, although annoying, is very storable. And thus, you can basically remove this part, because it'll be the best, well, you can't remove it, but what I'm saying is, like, in the comparison, this part is obsolete, right? Because you can get similar types of fuels in solid and liquid forms. It's not easy, but you can find very similar properties of fuels in either form that match over with each other. But oxidizer, you can't get a solid oxidizer core here, which makes this type of hybrid rocket engine not as good as this one by default, right? Because you are purposely using a worse oxidizer in the setup. And thus, this type of hybrid rocket engine has kind of fallen out of popularity. It's pretty obsolete. And thus, we're left with this setup. And this setup is quite good, and it's actually the focus of a lot of people's research right now, because it has the advantages of a liquid rocket engine, which I'll go over in just a short while, and it also has some of the it does have some of the cons of a liquid rocket engine, but in much less severe cases, and I'll show you why right after I've erased this whole thing. So that's why hybrid rocket engines right now are a topic of major interest, because they can theoretically be very efficient and very cost effective. Alright, so now we're going to get onto the most complex one, and I'll try and make this as digestible as possible. We have the liquid rocket engine. And the setup for this kind of looks like the hybrid rocket engine, but it's a little bit more complicated. So we'll have 2 tanks this time, not just one. We have 1 tank, and we'll have 2 tanks, right? And now, these tanks, one will have fuel, and one will have oxidizer. I don't know. Well, okay. We know that it's not going to be oxidizer at this point, right? Because it's going to be liquid, so we're just going to put oxygen in there. Right? So 1 tank of fuel, 1 tank of oxygen. And now below here, this by itself differentiates it between all the other engines. But then this structure here, I'm just going to make it a square because it's a little easier to draw. You'll never see a rocket engine like this. In my next video where I go over how these are operated, I'll make a much better drawing of it. I'm very bad at drawing. I try my best, but I'm not great. Although I guess I will learn how to. I'll do this. Right. And so this is what the very basic liquid rocket engine would look like. I've taken away most of the parts of the liquid rocket engine that are the most confusing. So let's go over what we have. Up here, these are tanks. Again, cryogenic and high temperature. Or very low temperature, high pressure. Right? Over here we have pipes with valves. And then here, this is your combustion chamber. And then over here, these little circles with the holes in them, these are your fuel injectors. And I can make a short on that as well. And then down here, this is your nozzle. And this specific type of nozzle is called a dual valve nozzle, because it has a large opening, a compression zone, and then an exit. So let's talk about how this would be operated, right? You would open both of these valves, and you have your fuel and your oxygen meeting at these fuel injectors, right? Each one for their own. Obviously, in some rocket engines, they just both go to the same one, and then this. Well, in most rocket engines, actually, you don't have 2 different injectors. It's just easier for this example to have 2 different injectors. But they both meet into these injectors, and then they're turned into little tiny droplets, right? Because it's a liquid, so you can turn it into little droplets. And here's why we do this. If we just had the fuel and the oxygen mixtures meet together and mix, and then lit that on fire, you would just be having an explosion. Again, rapid, unplanned disassembly, not ideal. So how do we do that? Well, we want to minimize volume and maximize surface area, right? Because by maximizing the surface area, you get a nice sustained combustion, as well as by minimizing volume, you don't get you don't get a bomb, basically. You don't get an explosion. So we put them through what essentially is very complicated shower drains. And again, when I make my own video on injectors, I'll explain that they're not actually just shower heads, but you theoretically could use a shower head for it. And what happens here is you've got very fine mists of both fuel and oxidizer together. And if your injectors are good, the mists will mix together. And when you light this on fire with some sort of electric lighter, or some sort of ignition source inside the combustion chamber, this mixture will combust, and the expanding gases have nowhere else to go but through the nozzle, right? And what the nozzle does is it takes a super high pressure gas, right? Like the rocket engine combustion chambers can get up to like 200, 300 bar, which is insane. And what they do is this nozzle here compresses them even further, and then after that they're just let out, right? So because you're letting this pressure go, you convert extremely high pressure gas, high pressure, high temperature, into high temperature, low pressure, high velocity gas, right? And thus you're throwing as much stuff as you can out the back of the engine as fast as you can, thus giving you the highest thrust possible. And the liquid rocket engine, again, has pros and cons. Pros. So the pros are, it's throttleable. Right, you can turn how much fluids of each you want in at a time. They're reliable. Although the solid rocket boosters are more reliable, these are also quite reliable when you build them right. Cons, very expensive. These injector plates especially, they're very maintenance heavy, so they require a lot of maintenance. And just in recent years when SpaceX made the Merlin engine, this maintenance part has kind of gone down a little bit, but they do require a lot of maintenance still. I'm just gonna get rid of this because you guys have seen this already. Yeah, I mean, this is essentially what it is. They're also very heavy, right? Because you have to think about, this nozzle is kind of shared with all of the tops of engines. Every engine has its own nozzle. So this part we can kind of excuse. This part, however, is very heavy. And again, the heavier your engine is, the more thrust you want it to produce to be able to at least be positive, right? You want the thrust to weight ratio to be very high, right? Because that's the thrust to weight ratio of your engine. You want that to be extremely high, because that doesn't account for the fuel tanks and all that. You want this ratio to be really high because you want to be able to carry more stuff up, right? Because the more payload you can take up, the less launches that you have to do. And launches are very expensive. So this concludes the liquid rocket engine. I'll just leave it up here for a couple seconds. Okay. And now I will try and do a transition to the next video a little bit. I'll give you a little taste of what we're doing in the next video. Although I might do a little bit of, I might also do a video on astrophysics before I do that video that I am going to introduce to you right now. Although I will say, in rocketry, engine failures, while not uncommon, they're not like completely unexpected sometimes, right? I mean, there's always something that can go wrong because, again, what I've drawn is the simplest types of all the engines. In reality, there's hundreds of more, well, probably even thousands of more pipes, valves, there's a lot that goes into these engines, and that's because I haven't even talked about the most complex part of the engines. And this is what I'm going to talk about right now, but in a very high level way, right? So I'm going to draw the engine horizontally, right? This is a tank of either fuel or oxidizer, you can choose. So I'll just put tank. I don't know why I added an E, my bad. And let's say this end goes to combustion chamber, through the injector plate into the combustion chamber. And what do you think about it? Okay, how do we get this fluid to there? Well, one way is to just have this at an extremely high pressure, right? Here's the thing, higher pressures require bigger walls of the tank, right? And bigger walls of the tank means it's going to be even heavier. And eventually you'll reach a point where it's just not worth it anymore because of the walls of the tank needed to keep that liquid in will get so ridiculously large that you need to figure out another solution, right? Okay, well, let's think about it. What if we have our tank, right, at, wow, that is the worst tank I've ever drawn. I'm so sorry. Right? You have your tank, and it's at a relatively good pressure. Why do I keep adding an EX? I don't know what I'm doing. Again, to combustion chamber, right? And what if we don't want this tank to be in extremely high pressure? Okay, what we can do is we can have another tank at a really, not like a really dumb amount of pressure, but you can have it at a much higher pressure than this will be, than this tank and this pipe will be, and you can have this tank push into this tank, right? And normally what's used is helium, because helium's an inert gas and won't react to anything. So that's good, that's a very viable solution, right? You're pushing gas inside this tank to push this gas that you want out further, right? Again, this brings up this problem though. This tank is gonna be heavy. And actually this technology was used quite a lot. If you look at the space shuttle boosters, or not the boosters, but the space shuttle orbital engines, right? The ones that are on the wings. This is exactly what was used. You can see on them, you can see two tanks going in to another tank, which is great. I mean, you can literally look up the image of a space shuttle engines, not like the RD-180, the engine on the bottom, but you can look up the engines that were used for orbital maneuvering, and you'll see this type of structure very clearly. Another way, and this is the way that leads us into the next video, is, well, let's think about this. What do we want in the combustion chamber? Well, we want a lot of fuel or oxidizer very quickly, right? So how do we transport fluids around? Well, we transport fluids by using a pump. Now, how do we get this pump to be able to transfer so much fluid so quickly? That is what the next video is on about, because then you can keep this at relatively low pressures, right? Thinner walls, thus lower mass. But you need a pump to push it. And, you know, you say, oh, we'll just use an electric pump. And that's true. And a company, the electron rocket, has done that. They've used an electric pump to spin this. They've used electricity to spin this pump and push the rocket through. And it's a viable solution. But how else could we do it, right? Well, and then this is what the entire next video is on about. What if we used a little bit of the rocket engine power to spin the pump, right? I mean, it seems like a viable idea. We have both the things there. We might as well use them, right? And that is it's what's called a rocket cycle, which is how to spin the pump to get the liquids into the combustion chamber as fast as possible. And yeah, that concludes today's video. Be sure to like and subscribe, and just leave down comments in the description about what you want me to make videos about. I've got a couple lined up, but after that I'll be taking suggestions from anyone, pretty much. You know, as long as they stick to the topic, I have no problem with making any videos that you guys want me to make. So yeah, goodbye, and I hope to see you here in the next video. Thank you for watching.